that allow us to engage in the kind of dialogue that Socrates and Thomas Aquinas and Thomas Jefferson, and yes, Charlie Kirk wanted us to do.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Bishop Barron delivered a sermon to a group of lawmakers and politicians during which he spent a significant amount of time reflecting on Charlie Kirk and, in connection to Charlie Kirk, the deterioration of our society into violence because of lack of free speech. And that is the reason why we have so much violence, a failure to communicate with one another about our differences and to be able to have a cordial conversation with people that we don't agree with. And of course, Charlie Kirk championed this so well. So in this clip, he talks about that. He also challenges lawmakers and politicians with a plea to take their jobs very seriously, and he does so by pointing to the fact that the law redirects our intentions, and actually changes our will. Law doesn't just prevent people from doing bad things; it can actually guide us in a society into the things that we ought to do. So there's a connection between spiritual revival, and that's what Bishop Barron thinks we need in this country, and obviously I think we need it as well. So check this out.
Even though I'm coming here at a difficult time in our country's life, difficult time in the culture. Just think here in Minneapolis, the summer began with the terrible political assassinations of Speaker Hortman and her husband, and of Representative Hoffman's shooting of him and his wife. And I met both of them last March when I was here with Archbishop Hebda for our visits. Then, of course, the summer ended with something perhaps even more horrific, the shooting of those two kids in Annunciation School, the traumatizing of how many hundreds more. We witnessed just recently the murder, seemingly in cold blood, of that young Ukrainian woman in Charlotte. And then, of course, last week, the murder of Charlie Kirk, which has convulsed the country. A lot of people wondering what's happening to us. I want to focus a bit on Charlie's murder. I knew him a little bit, admired him, and have been watching this convulsion in our country. What's causing it? Well, you say the death of this young man at 31, leaving behind a young wife and kids. Sure, of course. But I'm quite convinced there's more to it than that. I think what it is in his murder, we felt shaking something fundamental in our society. And the giveaway is the fact that he died with a microphone in his hand. What I mean is not a gun in his hand, not a knife in his hand, not a grenade in his hand, but with an instrument of communication in his hand. In witnessing that, whether consciously or not, I think we understand something fundamental is endangered. You know, watch him in action. A lot of people are opining about Charlie Kirk. Watch him, YouTube, there's thousands of videos. He liked to go to campuses, fairly hostile places to people with a conservative mindset. But he'd go there and he would express his point of view. Then he had him a microphone and he'd say, come on up and argue with me. Come up and debate with me. Prove me wrong. And that's exactly what he was doing the day he died. He was speaking with someone more liberally minded, and in the very act of doing that, he was murdered. This unnerves us, and it should unnerve us, because something in our Western civilization is threatened thereby. I think Charlie Kirk was standing in a very venerable tradition. Go all the way back to the man who in some ways is the founder of the Western intellectual tradition, Socrates. Socrates rarely gave lectures or speeches. What he did is he went in the streets and byways of Athens and he encountered mostly young people and he would ask them questions. Then he would question the answers they gave him. He would probe and he would push and cajole and he'd ask people to draw out the implications of what they believed. And in this lively back and forth, he felt he was coming closer to the truth. His greatest disciple, Plato, gave us in his famous dialogues just a kind of literary version of these Socratic conversations. Aristotle, Plato's greatest disciple, had a school called peripatetic because people walked around together, conversing, and in the conversation they came closer, they thought, to the truth. Draw a straight line from Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all the way to Oxford and Cambridge, where the principal method of teaching is not the lecture, but the conversation between tutor and pupil. That's the Athens side, if you want. The other great formative influence on our Western culture, the Jerusalem side. We can find much the same thing. If you're in a Jewish context and you're seeking truth, you don't listen to lectures so much, but rather two interlocutors sit apart across from each other with the scripture or the Talmud in between, and they argue and debate and they question, they cajole, they criticize, and they attend to conversations from long ago where people centuries before were doing exactly the same thing. In the lively give and take, they come closer to the truth. My intellectual hero, St. Thomas Aquinas, represents a Christian version of this. Thomas, the greatest of the masters of the medieval university system, rarely lectured. Rather, he engaged in what they called questiones disputate, disputed questions, where a master like Aquinas would propose a topic, and then he'd hear objections from the floor. And keep in mind, in the Paris of the 13th century, his interlocutors probably were kids in their teens and 20s. And they'd raise objections, then Thomas would give his answer, then respond to the objections. When we read the texts of Aquinas, they can seem rather dryly scholastic, but we have to see behind them this very lively dialogue discourse. Well, both Athens and Jerusalem contributed, it seems to me, to our founding fathers in the 18th century, who gave us precisely a political ethos based upon lively public exchange, debate, conversation, all predicated upon freedom of speech. It's very deep in the Western consciousness that kind of public discourse is a good thing. And it's an antidote to violence. Something I love that Charlie Kirk used to say. He'd be challenged by a kid who would say, "What are you doing here on campus? Why are you here?" He would say, when people stop talking to each other, bad things happen. When people in a relationship stop talking, divorce happens. When a society stops talking, civil war happens. Quite right, it seems to me. And that stretches right back to Socrates and provides a foundation for our society.
So this was the first part of Bishop Barron's homily, sermon, or speech. If you want to see the whole sermon, the link is in the description below to Bishop Barron's channel. Yeah, go watch it there in its entirety. I thought it was really interesting just to point this out because I think it can kind of go by the wayside. But Bishop Barron is actually comparing Thomas Aquinas with Charlie Kirk and vice versa. Charlie Kirk to Thomas Aquinas is probably the better way to think about that, in the sense that Thomas Aquinas was always interacting with young people in Paris at the university around disputed questions. And of course, Charlie Kirk was doing that as well, obviously in modernity and our modern era and time. Let me know what you think about that in the comment section below. The main thing that Bishop Barron, I think, is saying here is that freedom of speech, once it is lost, there will always be violence. It always leads to violence. Dialogue is in danger is another way to be thinking about it. There's one more part of the speech. It's towards the end of the speech that I want to show, and it has to do with this idea that I mentioned in the intro about the redirecting power of the law. Check this out.
The problem we're facing, it's not just a problem of law enforcement, although that's part of it, not just a problem of cultural and all, that's part of it. At bottom, everybody, it's a spiritual problem. It's a spiritual problem. This violence is coming from a loss of faith in God. Cardinal George of Chicago was kind of a mentor to me. He used to say, law indeed has a protective function. So law protects us, protects life, and so on. But law, he said, also properly has a directive function. Because the law teaches us what we ought to desire and what we ought not to desire. Law is meant to direct the will toward the good and away from evil. When law becomes simply a matter of defending individual prerogatives, it's lost its way. Can I suggest to all of you here gathered for this Mass, in this holy place, recovering the moral and high spiritual purpose of the law in helping to reform a society in which something like spirited conversation can take place, using the law to shore up those now shaking foundations that allow us to engage in the kind of dialogue that Socrates and Thomas Aquinas and Thomas Jefferson, and yes, Charlie Kirk wanted us to do. The fact that he died not with a gun in his hand, not a knife in his hand, not a grenade in his hand, not exercising violence, but with a means of communication in his hand. Can we take that as emblematic of the kind of society that we want? And can we see your work in law, as essential to a spiritual revival that we need in our country?
So Bishop Barron is tethering a spiritual revival to a right ordering of the society to the moral law. And I think what's so important to see with that is that this is a plea to lawmakers that might see law as trying to keep people from doing different sorts of things. It's trying to keep people away from it's litigating so much that it's trying to keep people away from doing things, and it's not seeing the law as transformative or spiritual in the sense that it's meant to order a society and every individual within that society to the proper desire. It's theological too, because I think many Christians, and this is a nation that was founded upon Christian principles, don't have a Christianity that sees um, a a use of the law that is helpful for ordering the soul towards something that is good, true, and beautiful. Obviously, American evangelicalism is really divorced from that great historical tradition that wedded many of the philosophical, virtuous principles with Christianity, especially expressed through the writings and teachings of somebody like Saint Thomas Aquinas. And I think that's where Bishop Barron is really touching on. Even C.S. Lewis, of course, who was Anglican, so he was in the Protestant tradition, and many evangelicals look up to C.S. Lewis, had this great perspective of the role of the law. He talked about the law of the law of nature, and of course, he plays on the fact that many people think that that is talking about some sort of scientific law of nature that's in nature, that is divorced from human nature. But law and nature, as it was always meant, was something that was innate within human beings, that they knew in their conscience the difference between right and wrong. We need to play on that as a society, and lawmakers and our Congress and politicians need to play on the fact that we are to spiritually form people to have a conscience that can recognize right and wrong. And of course, they have it. But the question is, are we using law to draw that out within them and to produce not just people that avoid certain things, but that are actually virtuous types of people? And I think that that is what Bishop Barron is getting back to. And then, of course, he's obviously connecting in this idea of freedom of speech and how important that is within our society. And it is so incredibly important. And I think you saw across the political spectrum that there were people on both sides of the political spectrum that knew how that are actually being formed and see the benefit of being able to have a conversation with somebody that differs from them. Also, the idea of not wanting to take a life. It's never good to take life. And either if you either whether or not you agree or disagree with a person, that you can recognize that when life is taken in such a horrific way as Charlie Kirk's was, that that is wrong, and we should never applaud or be happy about that. What an insane, sick society that is happy when somebody dies through a political assassination. Just insanity, really. And it starts with being able to have great conversations with each other, and Charlie Kirk and Thomas Aquinas and Socrates and all the people that Bishop Barron mentioned are really they're martyrs for that when you think about it in some sense. At least Socrates and Charlie Kirk are. Just something to be thinking about today. Remember that Jesus Christ ultimately was a lot like this as well. He went into the public space and he didn't just use a microphone as a way of communication. He was the divine revelation of God, and he spoke directly from God, and he died on the cross for our sins, not so that we might just so that we could be saved and we could become people that God would want us to be. So it's ultimately about Him. Everything funnels back down to Him. And how are you aligning your life to Him today? Be thinking about that. Love y'all. Grace and peace. See you in the next. Peace.